She heard him move the microphone stand away from where she had placed it. That small scrape of metal on wood, barely audible above the jazz quartet. Then Vanessa Price stepped up to it instead.
But it's not.
Adaise had prepared for that moment for 3 months, and someone had simply walked into it, and no one in that room understood that the building they were all standing in belonged to her. The event was called the Callaway and Partners 10th Anniversary Gala, and Adaise had organized every element of it from the ground up. She had selected the venue, negotiated the catering contract, approved the floral arrangements, proofread the printed programs, and confirmed the guest list 3 separate times. 120 guests, 18 round tables draped in white linen, a chilled champagne service that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. The Sol Room occupied the entire 24th floor of the Magnolia Grand Hotel in downtown Houston. The eastern wall was floor-to-ceiling glass, and beyond it the city's skyline glittered in the October dark like something Emeka Nwosu had once promised his daughter was possible. Chandelier light fell warm and gold across the room. The 4 musicians in the corner played a version of Autumn Leaves that Adaise had requested specifically because her father had loved that song. She had arrived early, as she always did, and moved through the space, checking details that no one else would think to check. The placement of the name cards, the temperature of the room, the angle of the spotlight on the podium. She wore a dress, the color of deep eucalyptus, cut straight at the shoulder, and her hair was pinned up at the back. Inside the small silk clutch on her wrist was the pocket watch, the one she carried everywhere and showed to no one. Marcus arrived 40 minutes later with the confidence of a man who believed the evening had been assembled by magic. He looked good, and he knew it. Custom suit, pocket square, the easy handshake of someone who had rehearsed being impressive. He moved through the room, accepting congratulations from business partners and city officials and colleagues who had come to celebrate the 10-year mark of a company he ran and his wife had quietly, invisibly sustained. Adaise watched him from across the room. She did not approach. She had stopped approaching Marcus at events 18 months ago, around the time she noticed the particular way he angled his phone screen away from her when it vibrated on the kitchen counter. Lorraine Calloway arrived at table 1 and sat down with the settled authority of a woman who had assigned herself that seat without asking anyone. She was Marcus's mother, 70 years old, immaculate in navy blue, and she had never once in 11 years of marriage called Adaise by her first name. She called her that girl in private and nothing at all in public, which was a strategy that had worked well until tonight. Darius, Marcus's older brother, came in with his wife and immediately began working the room the way he always worked rooms, loud and backslapping and eager to be adjacent to whatever was succeeding. Tiffany, the younger sister, arrived alone and went directly for the champagne, holding her phone at waist height in the way people do when they are already deciding what to record. Vanessa Price was the last to arrive. She came through the entrance at 7:47, 13 minutes after the gala officially opened, and the timing was deliberate. Adaise recognized that kind of timing. It was the entrance of someone who had considered their entrance. Vanessa wore a wrap dress in deep amber that moved when she moved, and she wore it with the composure of a woman who had been told she was beautiful so many times she had simply decided to believe it. She was Marcus's strategic consultant, which was the title listed on the program Adaise had proofread. Marcus saw her from across the room. His face changed in a way that a stranger might not catch. Adaise had been watching that face for 11 years. She did not look away. She let herself see it clearly, completely, one final time. Then she turned and made sure the catering team had set out the correct wines for the dinner service. The meal proceeded without incident, if you did not count the incidents. Lorraine, from table 1, caught Adaise's eye during the salad course and tapped the side of her glass lightly, a gesture that meant, "Come, refill this." Adaise held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then turned back to her conversation with the woman from the Houston Chamber of Commerce seated to her left. Darius leaned over to his wife and said something that made his wife look at Adaise and then look away. Tiffany had her phone out. These were not new behaviors. They had been practicing them for years. After the main course, The evening's program was supposed to begin with what the printed agenda called a tribute to the partners behind the vision. Adais had written that line herself. She had also prepared remarks. She had a note card in her clutch with 4 paragraphs she had spent 2 weeks writing and rewriting because she believed that public words mattered and deserved care. The MC, a local television personality who had been hired at $2,000 for the evening, stepped to the podium. "Before we begin the awards portion of our evening," he said, "I'd like to invite the person who makes all of this possible to say a few words. The heart of Callaway and Partners. The one without whom, frankly, none of us would be standing in this beautiful room tonight." Adais set down her fork. She began to rise. Marcus stood first. He stood, and he crossed to where Vanessa was seated, and he placed his hand on her lower back, a gesture that was not casual, that was not ambiguous, that was not something you did to a strategic consultant in a room full of your wife's invited guests. He guided Vanessa toward the podium with the steady, directing pressure of a man presenting someone he had decided to present. The room felt it. The shift in energy was physical, like pressure changing before a storm. Several guests turned their heads. A few looked at Adais. Vanessa reached the podium. She curved her fingers around the microphone stand, adjusted it 2 inches toward herself, and smiled at the room. The smile was practiced and genuine at the same time, which was a difficult thing to be, and Adais noticed it. At table 1, Lorraine lifted her champagne glass. She looked at Vanessa. She drank. Darius raised his glass and tapped it with a spoon. The sound rang out across the room. Tiffany lifted her phone, and on the floor beside the podium, leaning against the base of the stand where it had been placed 2 hours ago by the events coordinator, following Adais's instructions, stood a framed plaque, dark walnut wood, brass plate. The engraving read, "Adais Callaway, the heart of this company." It had not moved. No one had touched it. It stood there, in the peripheral vision of 120 people, looking like something that had been forgotten. Adais picked up her cloth napkin from her lap. She folded it once, along the crease that was already there. She set it beside her plate, parallel to the fork, exactly where it had been before she unfolded it at the start of the meal. She stood. She walked to the glass door that opened onto the exterior balcony, and she stepped through it. The October air in Houston was cool and carried the faint metallic smell of the city after dark. Below, 24 floors down, traffic moved in slow amber lines. Adais stood at the railing and did not look back through the glass at the party behind her. She opened her clutch and took out the pocket watch. It was small, heavy for its size, brass worn to a soft brown at the edges. The crystal face was slightly clouded. The chain was silver and had thinned over the years at the clasp. She held it in both hands the way you hold something that cannot be replaced. She did not open it. She just held it. She thought of the last morning, the hospital corridor, the smell of antiseptic, her father's hands on the bed rail, the particular steadiness of his voice when he was rationing his strength. She stood on the balcony for 4 minutes. Then she put the watch back in her clutch, turned around, and looked at the city her father had built beneath her feet. She had been 7 years old when her mother died, and 8 years old when she understood, in the wordless way that children understand things, that she and her father were the whole of each other's world. They lived in 5th Ward in a house that had 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that smelled like groundnut soup on Sunday evenings. Emeka Nwosu drove a truck that had rust along the wheel wells and a radio that picked up only 2 stations clearly. He was not a man who explained himself. He was a man who showed you things and waited. Every Saturday morning, in every season, he drove. He drove to lots that were empty, to warehouses that had their windows boarded, to strips of land between highways that collected litter and looked like nothing. He brought Adais with him. She sat in the passenger seat and watched him get out of the truck, walk across the land, and stand very still. He would look in all 4 directions. He would squat and pick up a handful of soil. He would turn it over in his palm. And sometimes he would let it fall, and sometimes he would carry it back to the truck in his closed fist. She asked him once what he was doing. He went quiet in the way he always went quiet before he answered a question that mattered. Then he knelt down beside her, which he did not do often because he was a tall man and kneeling cost him something. He put the soil in her hand. It was just dirt, just dry Houston soil with a few blades of dead grass in it. "This," he said, in the accent that never entirely left him, "does not go anywhere." He wrapped her fingers around it. "Everything else goes. People go, jobs go, money goes, if you are careless. But the ground stays. The one who owns the ground has something that cannot be taken in the night." Adaise was 8 years old. She did not fully understand, but she remembered. What she did not know, for most of her childhood, was the scale of what her father was doing on those Saturday mornings. She thought he was a site foreman, maybe a property manager for someone else's buildings. He wore work clothes. He drove the rusted truck. He packed his lunch in a thermos and a paper bag. He did not have a secretary or a business card or a car with a logo on the door. He had none of the things she would later learn to associate with wealth. What he had was a mind that could see 50 years into the future while standing on a vacant lot in the present. He had the patience of someone who understood that value and price were not the same thing and that the distance between them was opportunity. He had over 30 years of work that no one witnessed and very few people knew about, assembled a portfolio of land and buildings across Houston, Dallas, and Atlanta that had been structured through a holding company called Nuwasu Land Holdings, a limited liability company with shell entities and reinvestment vehicles so carefully layered that not even his banker knew the full picture. He was, by any reasonable measure, worth several $100 million. He lived in Fifth Ward and drove the rusted truck and clipped coupons from the Sunday newspaper. He did this deliberately. He did this for Adaise. He wanted his daughter to grow up knowing who she was before she knew what she had, because he understood, with the clarity of a man who had come from Lagos with $100 and a diploma and built something from pure attention and discipline, that money told you nothing true about a person. It only amplified what was already there. Adaise was 22 and in her third year at Prairie View studying accounting when she got the call from Houston Methodist Hospital. Her father had collapsed at a work site. Massive myocardial infarction. By the time she arrived, he had been moved to the cardiac intensive care unit and had been stabilized enough to be scheduled for open-heart surgery the following morning. She sat with him that night and slept in the chair beside his bed. In the morning, before the surgical team arrived, he woke and looked at her for a long time without speaking. His hands were resting on the bed rail. She noticed they were trembling, finely and continuously, which she had never seen in her father's hands before. He reached into the pocket of his hospital gown. He had asked a nurse to retrieve the pocket watch from his personal effects bag the night before, and it had been there in the gown pocket when they brought him back from preparation. He pulled it out with both hands. The chain caught, and he had to work it free, and when he finally held it out to her, she took it without understanding what was happening. He looked past her at the ceiling. His voice was measured and very quiet, and had in it the quality of a man spending carefully. "The ground holds everything," he said. "It does not need to speak." She said, "Papa." He turned and looked at her then. The look was complete. It had everything in it. The surgical team came at 7:15. She walked beside the gurney to the double doors and stopped where she was required to stop and watched the doors swing closed. She stood there for a long time after. He did not come out of surgery. The service was held at a small Baptist church in Fifth Ward, in the pew where Emeka had sat most Sundays for 20 years. About 60 people attended, neighbors and former colleagues, and a few faces Adaise did not recognize, men in good suits who stood at the back and did not speak to anyone. One of them approached her afterward in the parking lot. He was in his late 50s, silver at his temples, and he moved with the deliberate courtesy of a man accustomed to delivering difficult information in contained settings. "Miss Nwosu," he said, "my name is Leonard Okafor. I was your father's attorney and his closest friend for 15 years. I need to speak with you. Not today, but soon." She met him in his office 4 days later. She sat across from his desk, still in the suspended unreality of grief, and Leonard spread before her the most precise and systematic thing she had ever seen, the full cartography of what Emeka Nwosu had built. 31 properties, office buildings, residential complexes, a light industrial park outside Dallas, parcels of land in 3 metro areas that had been purchased at prices that seemed, at the time of purchase, baffling and now seemed prophetic. The portfolio had been restructured 3 times over 20 years to maximize asset protection and minimize exposure. Current combined valuation, $480 million. Ade sat with that number for a very long time. She thought about the thermos in the paper bag. She thought about the Sunday coupons. She thought about a man who could have lived anywhere and who chose to stay in Fifth Ward until his heart stopped because he was not building for himself. Leonard explained the inheritance structure, the ownership structure of the LLC, the tax instruments. He explained that Emeka had been specific in his instructions. Addie's was to know nothing until after his death, and even then she was to receive the information in private, with time to decide how she wished to proceed. There was no pressure. There was no timeline. There was only the question of what she wanted to do with what her father had left her. What she decided, sitting in Leonard Okafor's office with the afternoon light coming through the blinds, was that she was going to honor her father in the most direct way she knew. She was not going to tell anyone. She finished her degree. She took a position teaching mathematics at a middle school in Fifth Ward, which was the right kind of work and put her in the right kind of rooms. Leonard managed the portfolio and sent her quarterly reports. She read every one. She studied property law, contract structures, development cycles. On weekends, she drove to the properties and walked them, the way her father had walked the empty lots. She was learning the language of the thing she had inherited, and she was learning it from the inside. She met Marcus Calloway at a real estate industry conference 5 years after her father died. He was presenting a session on Houston commercial market trends, and he was good at it, precise and energetic and funny in the way that people are funny when they know their material. He approached her afterward at the coffee station, and he made her laugh within the first 4 minutes, and she thought, here is someone who pays attention. He was a regional director at a mid-sized development firm, ambitious, focused, the kind of man who was going to make something of himself and wanted a partner who understood that drive. He was attentive in the months of courtship, present and consistent and careful with her in the way that a person is careful with something they value. Adaiz did not tell him about the portfolio. She had reasons, layered and clear. The first was practical. She had learned from her father that the people who found out you had money had a way of reorganizing their feelings about you afterward, and she wanted to see Marcus's feelings in their natural state. The second was her father's voice at the table in Fifth Ward when she was 15 and had come home upset about a boy who had been kind to her and then unkind. You will never know if they love you or what you have until the moment you have nothing. That is why you must be careful. She was careful. She said yes when Marcus proposed. She said it honestly, without reservation, because at that moment she believed what she was seeing. The first years were good. Marcus was present for the birth of Isaiah, and then, 20 months later, for Nadia. He was a capable father in the early years, attentive and interested, and Adaiz believed they were building something that would last. Then came the promotions. Each step up the professional ladder brought a version of Marcus that was slightly less the man she had married. Senior manager came with a new car and a habit of speaking over people at dinner. Director came with a set of new friends whose primary characteristic was that they were impressed by titles. Vice president came with the cold, evaluating gaze that Adaiz began to notice turned toward her when she spoke about her volunteer work, her teaching background, the education committee she had joined. You should be doing something with your life, he said once. Carefully, pleasantly, the way you say something you have decided to stop being cautious about. She had been sitting across from him at the kitchen table. She held the statement and did not respond, and later that night she took out the quarterly report from Leonard Okafor and read it with the particular focus of someone who is deciding how much more patience they have. Then came Vanessa. Adaiz noticed her the way you notice weather. First, the small indicators, the angled phone, the extra care taken before leaving the house, a kind of pre-distraction that preceded his actual distraction. Then the behavior became less careful, as infidelity tends to when the person doing it has decided that the person being deceived is too passive to respond. Lorraine, who had always treated Adaze as a guest in her own marriage, began to treat Marcus's absence from the home as an opportunity. She arrived at the house with Vanessa's name already in her mouth, as though she had been rehearsing. "Marcus deserves a woman who challenges him," she said, in the living room, on a Tuesday afternoon, while Adaze's children were napping upstairs. Lorraine said this to the air in the general direction of Adaze, and then accepted a glass of water and changed the subject. Adaze did not respond to this either. She was understanding, during this period, that silence was not merely absence. It was a practice, a discipline, the thing her father had lived as architecture. The ground holds everything. It does not need to speak. She was also, during this period, making phone calls. 2 months before the gala, she called Leonard Okafor from her car in the parking garage beneath a grocery store on Westheimer. It was a Thursday. She had just bought vegetables for dinner. "Leonard," she said when he picked up, "I need you to pull together everything on the portfolio status. Full current documentation, all 31 properties." A pause. "All right," he said. "Any particular reason for the timing?" "We have a company event in 2 months. I need you there. Bring Wakefield and Torres." Another pause. Longer this time. "Adaze," he said carefully. "I'm sure," she said. "My father was sure before I was. I'm just finally catching up." She heard him exhale slowly. "I'll have everything ready," he said. She ended the call, sat in the car for a moment, and then went inside to make dinner for her children. The night of the gala, after she had stood on the balcony with her father's pocket watch in her hands and let the cool air clear something out of her, Adaze went back inside. She did not go to her table. She went to the corridor outside the service entrance and found her phone and sent a single text message to Leonard. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m., Okafor and Webb. Bring all 3. Then she went back into the ballroom, found Nadia's school friend's mother, who had come as her guest, and asked her if she could arrange a car home for the children. Isaiah and Nadia had attended the early portion of the evening and were now in a side room off the lobby watching a movie on a tablet with a babysitter. She kissed them both. Isaiah, 9 years old, looked at her face with the reading ability that children develop when they grow up watching an adult manage something difficult. "You okay, Mama?" "I am very okay," she said. "I will see you at home." She went back to the gala and stayed for the remaining hour and a half. She was present, attentive, spoke with every table. She thanked the musicians personally. She tipped the catering team. When the evening ended, she was the last person in the room, and she stood in the center of it for a moment before the lights were lowered, looking at the glass wall and the city beyond it, and she thought about her father standing on a piece of land in 5th Ward and turning a handful of soil over in his palm. She picked up the plaque from where it was, still leaning against the base of the podium. She carried it out herself. The offices of Okafor and Webb Advisory occupied the 14th floor of a building on Post Oak Boulevard. 3 days after the gala, at 9 in the morning, Adaze sat across from Leonard in the conference room with Wakefield and Torres on either side of him, 2 attorneys she had known for years and trusted entirely. The table was covered in documents. They reviewed everything methodically, item by item: current valuations, lease agreements, ownership structure, the specific details of the lease between Nwosu Land Holdings and Callaway and Partners, which had been in place for 7 years and which covered the primary office premises in downtown Houston, 2 floors of a building at 11 Greenway Plaza. The lease was valid. The terms were clear. The signatory on behalf of the landlord was Adaze Nwosu Callaway. Marcus had never read it. He had left the lease management to his office administrator, who processed payments to an account associated with the Nwosu Land Holdings. He had never asked who owned the entity. He had no reason to. His wife was quiet and seemed to have no particular professional concerns. Leonard also laid out the lease for the residential property in the Galleria area, a 2-bedroom apartment that Lorraine Calloway had been occupying for the past 3 years at below market rate, through an arrangement Marcus had made without telling a days. The building was a 12-unit residential property owned by Nwosu Land Holdings. Adais reviewed all of it without speaking. Then she looked up. "Meridian Capital," she said. "What is the status of the expansion negotiation?" Leonard folded his hands on the table. "They're scheduled to sign next Thursday. $41 million. Marcus has been working that deal for 8 months. Where is the signing taking place?" 11 Greenway Plaza, the Calloway and Partners Conference Room. Adais nodded. "All right," she said. "Then that is where we go." The morning of the Meridian Capital signing was the kind of morning that Houston does well in early November. Clear and cool, with a sky that has gone a particular shade of blue. Adais wore a charcoal suit that she had owned for 3 years, tailored, straight, not new but precisely right. She wore low heels. Her hair was down. She clipped her father's pocket watch to her vest pocket and let the silver chain rest outside the fabric. She arrived at 11 Greenway Plaza at 10:15, 45 minutes before the signing was scheduled to begin. The lobby security guard, a man she had seen several times over the years, nodded to her. She nodded back and took the elevator to the 12th floor. She stood in the hallway for a moment outside the conference room door and listened. Voices inside, the particular efficient murmur of a professional gathering before the main event. She heard Marcus's voice, confident and carrying, running through something with someone. She heard Lorraine's voice. She opened the door and walked in. The room was arranged around a long conference table. At one end sat the Meridian Capital delegation, 6 people, including a woman in a slate gray jacket who was clearly the principal, binder open, pen uncapped. Around the other end of the table were Marcus, his 2 senior partners, and their legal team. Lorraine occupied a chair along the side wall, present as a symbolic figure of family continuity. Vanessa stood behind Marcus's chair with a portfolio under her arm. They all looked at Adais. Marcus's expression moved through several stages very quickly. Recognition, surprise, the beginning of a social adjustment, and then something harder. "Adais," he said, "what are you doing here?" She did not answer him directly. She looked at Leonard, who had entered behind her with Wakefield and Torres, and nodded once. Leonard stepped forward. His voice was composed and carried the weight of someone who had spent 30 years in rooms where important things were decided. "Good morning. My name is Leonard Okafor, senior partner at Okafor and Webb Advisory Group. I represent Nwosu Land Holdings, LLC, the owner of this building and the lesser of record for this premises. I am here to notify all parties of a situation that materially affects the transaction scheduled to take place in this room this morning." He reached behind him, and Wakefield placed a remote in his hand. The conference room screen on the far wall, the one Marcus had planned to use for his Meridian Capital presentation, came to life. A map appeared. 31 properties marked in deep red across Houston, Dallas, and Atlanta, each one labeled 1 at 11 Greenway Plaza, Houston, outlined in a thick border. Then the next slide. The first page of the Calloway and Partners lease agreement, enlarged to fill the screen. The signature line at the bottom. Landlord Representative, Adais Nwosu Calloway. The room was very quiet. The principal from Meridian Capital, whose name Adais would later learn was Claire Huang, set down her pen and looked at the screen for a long moment. Then she looked at Adais. Marcus's voice came out thinner than it usually was. "What is this?" "This building belongs to my client," Leonard said, "as does the property currently occupied as a personal residence by Lorraine Calloway." He paused. "As do 30 other commercial and residential properties across 3 states. The portfolio has a current combined valuation of $480 million. All assets are held under sole ownership by Adais Nwosu Calloway through Nwosu Land Holdings, LLC, a company she has operated and developed for the past 11 years. He stepped aside. Adais walked to the head of the table. She did not raise her voice. She stood the way her father had stood on empty lots in the early morning, without urgency, without performance, with the particular stillness of someone who knows exactly where they are. "My name is Ades Nwosu Calloway," she said. "My father was Emeka Nwosu. He came to Houston from Lagos, Nigeria, with $100 and a civil engineering degree, and he spent 30 years building something in silence because he understood that the value of work is not in the announcement, but in what remains. He built this portfolio for me. He built it so that I could stand on ground that was mine and never have to ask permission to stand. I did not tell my husband about this inheritance. I did not tell him because I wanted to be known for who I was. I wanted to know, clearly, without any doubt, who the people around me were. I have spent 11 years finding out. This room sits in a building I own. The lease that allows Calloway and Partners to occupy this floor was signed by me. Any expansion agreement executed under these circumstances, without my knowledge and without my consent as the landlord of record, would be legally irregular and subject to immediate challenge. I am not here to destroy a business. I am here because decisions were made in this building at my expense and at the expense of my children by people who believed I had nothing and therefore was nothing. I need those people to understand whose ground they were standing on when they made those decisions." She looked at Marcus. He did not look like a man who was calculating a response. He looked like a man who was understanding, for the first time, the actual dimensions of what he had been living inside. "You knew," he said. "It was not an accusation. It was something smaller than that." "I always knew," she said, and her voice was level and without cruelty. "You just never asked." Lorraine had not moved from her chair by the wall. Her hands were clasped in her lap. She was looking at the screen, at the map with its 31 red points, and her face had the expression of someone watching a structure they believed to be permanent turn out to be temporary. Vanessa Price did not wait for more. She picked up her portfolio from where it rested against the back of Marcus's chair, walked to the door, opened it, and left. The door closed behind her with a sound that was quieter than anything else that had happened in the room that morning. Leonard stepped forward again. "I have documentation here for the parties of record." He placed a folder in front of Marcus. "This is formal notice that the current lease agreement for the Calloway and Partners office premises at 11 Greenway Plaza will not be renewed at the end of the current term, which expires in 60 days. The terms of the lease do not provide for automatic renewal and require written consent from the landlord, which will not be provided." He placed a second document on the side table near Lorraine's chair. She did not reach for it. "This is formal notice regarding the residential lease at the Galleria property. Same terms, 60 days. He turned to Claire Huang, who had been watching all of this with the focused attention of a person who processes information for a living. "Miss Huang, on behalf of the property owner, I apologize for the interruption to your morning. You will understand that any agreement executed in this space under these circumstances would require our client's prior written consent and review. We are available to discuss at a future date." Claire Huang stood. She looked at Ades. Then she crossed the room, which was not a small distance, and extended her hand. Ades took it. "Your father built something remarkable," Claire Huang said quietly. "He did," Ades said. Claire Huang nodded once and left, her delegation following in a quiet line. The room emptied in stages. The Calloway legal team gathered their things without speaking. Marcus's two partners looked at each other and at the floor and at the door. Lorraine rose finally and took the document from the side table without reading it and walked out. She did not look at Ades. The room emptied until it was only Marcus. He was still seated. The Meridian Capital pen was still on the table, uncapped, unused. He looked at her, and she could see in his face the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent years building a self-image and has just watched it fail a structural inspection. "I don't know what to say to you," he said. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "Leonard will be in contact with your attorney." She picked up her clutch from the chair where she had set it. She touched the pocket of her vest once, briefly, confirming the weight of the watch through the fabric. Then she walked out of the conference room, down the corridor, and into the elevator. The doors closed, and she stood alone in the mirrored interior as the elevator descended, and she looked at herself, and she thought about a Saturday morning in Fifth Ward when she was 8 years old, and the city was early and quiet, and her father was kneeling on a patch of ground that looked like nothing at all. 8 months later, the light in Adieza's private office at the Nwosu Land Holdings headquarters was the color of early morning, warm and low, coming from the bronze desk lamp that had been her father's. She arrived before her staff on most mornings. She liked the hour before the building filled. She was reviewing an acquisition file, a piece of light industrial land on the outer edge of the Dallas metro, currently priced well below what she calculated its value would be in 7 years, when the infrastructure corridor being planned 2 miles east was completed. The file was spread before her, photographs and survey documents, and a projection sheet she had put together herself in the evenings. She worked in pencil, marking what she wanted to remember. From the room adjacent came the sounds of her children. She had built that room specifically for the mornings when school did not begin until 9, and she needed to be at her desk at 6. Isaiah was 9 now, and read independently. Nadia was 7, and drew landscapes on large sheets of paper that she had begun taping to the walls of the small room in an evolving mural that no one had told her to stop. The sound of Nadia's crayon on paper came through the wall, steady and purposeful. Adez paused in her work and listened to that sound for a moment. Marcus had moved into a rented apartment in the months after Callaway and Partners lost its office premises. The firm had contracted sharply, its expansion plans permanently interrupted. He was still operating, technically, out of a suite in a suburban business complex, but the $40 million Meridian deal had not been recovered, and several other clients had quietly redirected their business. He was seeing Isaiah and Nadia on the schedule that had been agreed through the attorneys, once a month, supervised, which was more than he had earned, but was what Adez had chosen to offer because her children loved him despite what he had done, and she had decided that love should not be punished for someone else's failures. Lorraine Callaway was living in an apartment in Humble, 40 minutes from the Galleria. Adez knew this because Leonard had handled the outgoing notices and followed up once to confirm receipt. She had not spoken to Lorraine since the morning at 11 Greenway Plaza and did not intend to. Some debts are not meant to be paid, they are meant to be recorded and then set down. Darius had closed his consulting practice. He was working independently now in commercial real estate, starting over, which was appropriate. Tiffany had lost 3 brand partnerships in the weeks after video of the gala circulated online under captions that Adez had not written and did not need to. The internet has its own form of accounting. Vanessa Price had relocated to Dallas. This was all Adez knew, and it was sufficient. Adez set down her pencil and looked at the acquisition file for a long moment. Then she reached up to the pocket of her vest and found the chain. She held her thumb against the silver links, feeling the worn smoothness that came from 30 years of her father's hands doing exactly this, touching the chain without taking the watch out, just confirming the weight of it. She did not remove the watch. She just held the chain. She thought about him on the last morning, not the grief of it, not the clinical brightness of the hospital, but the quality of his voice, the way he had rationed the words as though he knew they were the last he would spend on her, the way he had not looked at her directly until the final moment, as though he was gathering himself first. She was not thinking about what she had done. She was not thinking about Meridian Capital or the documents spread across a conference table or a man sitting alone at the end of an emptied room. She was thinking about a Saturday morning and the smell of dry soil and a question she had asked once when she was 8 years old, and the answer that had taken her 31 years and $480 million and 11 years of a marriage and one night on a 24th floor balcony to fully understand. The ground holds everything. It does not need to speak. From the next room, Nadia called out, in the particular tone of a 7-year-old who has made something and wants it witnessed. "Mama, come see." Adez released the chain. She stood and straightened her jacket and went to see what her daughter had made. The land does not rise up. It simply remains, long after everything built on betrayal has fallen. If you know someone who has been carrying something quietly for a long time, leave one word below. Just one word. They will know what it means.